Hello, my name is Rony and I am a doctoral researcher in the University of Eastern Finland. I am specializing in the field of church history and currently studying the meaning of Christianity and religions in the social networks of peace movements. In this presentation, I will handle especially the organizing of the two Baltic conferences of the peace ecumenical organization called the International Fellowship of Reconciliation. The name of this presentation is, quote, "Not a wall but a bridge to take the spirit of reconciliation to the East," end quote. The relation between ideology and motivation in the Nordic social networks organizing the two Baltic conferences of the International Fellowship of Reconciliation in 1928 and in 1938. The focus will be in the qualitative features of the Nordic social networks essential to the organizing of these two conferences. More particularly, I am interested to understand the relation between ideology and motivation in these social networks. So how the ideology of the main actors and organizations explain their motivation to be part of these Nordic social networks organizing the conferences. This presentation's source material consists mainly on press reports regarding the two conferences and of some speeches held either in the conference or just before it. First, very general knowledge on the two conferences. The first Baltic Conference in 1928 was organized in Tartu, Estonia, as the second Baltic Conference 10 years later was organized in Helsinki, Finland. One of the main organizers in both of these conferences came from Sweden, and naturally the different locations of these two conferences determined that the Estonians took responsibility on the practical organizing of the first conference, as the Finnish took care of the practical organizing of the second conference. In Tartu, there were approximately 200 participators from 9 different countries. Most of the participators were from Estonia, but there were also people coming from Scandinavian countries, from USA, Austria, Germany, Lithuania, and so on. Due to the chaotic world political situation, the participation rate in Helsinki was a lot smaller, as only 60 participants, mainly from Nordic countries, could attend. The main organization behind these Baltic conferences were the International Fellowship of Reconciliation. Without going too much into the history of the organization, what is nevertheless relevant from the point of view of this presentation is the International Fellowship of Reconciliation's strong ideological ties to Christian socialism. In the organization's first international conference, organized in Bilthoven, Netherlands in 1919, it was actually decided that the organization's name would be Christian International. The first declaration sent out by the conferees in 1919 was called A Movement Towards a Christian International, which actually was a modification of the declaration called A Motion to Establish a Communist International that was sent out by the Communist International in the same year, 1919. The Communist International, more shortly known as the Comintern, was a cooperative organ of the radical socialist and communist parties, and it was led by the Bolsheviks, who had taken power over Russia in a violent revolution in the year 1917. Like the Comintern, the Christian International was also, quote, against capitalism and imperialism to the very end quote, and wanted to socialize the means of production. But it was against the Comintern's violent revolutionary ideas, as it wanted to transform the Bolshevist revolution in Russia into a non-violent, Christian-based world revolution of love. Due to these ideological standpoints, it was decided already in the conference year 1920 that the Christian International from 1923 forward, known as the International Fellowship of Reconciliation, would try to establish connections to Russia. The two Baltic conferences can be seen as being part of this effort. The practical organizing of the first Baltic conference was given to the Swedish branch of the International Fellowship of Reconciliation called Förbundet för kristet samhällsliv. This Förbundet för kristet samhällsliv was constituted already before the Christian International. But the two organizations had such similar aims that the Förbundet för kristet samhällsliv became the Swedish branch of the Christian International, later known as International Fellowship of Reconciliation, in 1921. The Förbundet för kristet samhällsliv was led by Nathanael Beskow, who soon became crucial to the work of the International Fellowship of Reconciliation. In the 1920s, Beskow, for example, led the humanitarian aid and fundraising project of the International Fellowship of Reconciliation, which helped the victims suffering from the Armenian genocide. The planning of the International Fellowship of Reconciliation's first Baltic Conference began in 1927, and from the very beginning, Förbundet för kristet samhällsliv, and from there, especially Nathanael Beskow, took an active and leading position both in the planning and executing stages of the conference. This raises the question, what elements in the ideology of Nathanael Beskow explain his willingness to take so active role in the first conference? Beskow did not handle contemporary political subjects directly in his speeches. He more focused to the theological principles that should be taken into account when doing Christian work. And it is these theological principles he had in 1928 that reveal something essential about his motivation to organize and participate this conference. The theme of the first conference was brotherhood, and subjects dealt more closely were such as brotherhood between nations, social classes and races. Also, the subject of how Christians could build brotherhood was in essential role. In the opening speech of the conference, Beskow said, quote, "The Baltic countries should not be seen as a wall, but more as a bridge to take the spirit of reconciliation to the east." A few days before, when going to the Baltic conference, Beskow had also held a speech in Helsinki, where he said something revealing from the point of view of this presentation. Beskow said, quote, "There are persons who work to establish a Christian society without knowing it and without themselves being Christians. There are also many of those who want to be Christians and are very enthusiastic to convert souls, but practically work against Christian society." End quote. So Beskow believed into the possibility that even a non-Christian could take the Christian society forward. In Tartu, Beskow said, quote, "He who is able to at least suspect something of the eternal human in every human individual he encounters. For him, the usual limits are not there. His love does not depend on group, type, class, nationality, or race. That is why the apostle of the Christian community said, 'There is neither Jew nor Greek, neither servant nor free, neither man nor woman, because you are all one in Christ Jesus.' All categories are invalid, because here only man stands against man." End quote. In the historical context of the year 1928, when Christians feared a lot of the spreading of communism, it is evident that Beskow here is talking about communists. He did not want to see communism as something evil or satanic, as was commonly thought amongst Christians. Rather, he believed into the possibility that even an atheist communist has something eternal human inside of him, and that he or she could take the Christian society forward in some ways. Therefore, he wanted to establish a dialogue between Christians and socialists and communists. This explains why Besko was so motivated in organizing of the first Baltic Conference and why he said that the Baltic countries should be seen as a bridge to take the spirit of reconciliation to the east, which practically in this case meant Russia. In addition to these ideological motives, there were also domestic church political issues that motivated the Estonian organizers of the first Baltic Conference in Tartu. The organizing of the conference in the Estonian end was given to Hugo and Edith Rahamägi. Hugo Rahamägi was a professor in the systematic theology in the University of Tartu, and his wife Edith later, after the conference, established the Estonian branch of the International Fellowship of Reconciliation. With the help of the conference, they were interested to reconcile the relationship between the Lutheran Baltic Germans and the Lutheran Estonians, who had a argue over the ownership of the Tallinn's cathedral, which had traditionally belonged to Baltic Germans, but was now in the 1920s being moved into the possession of the Estonians due to the rising nationalism in Estonia. The conferees could not settle the dispute, but after the conference, Edith Rahamägi kept in contact with Friedrich Sigmund Schulz, who was the leader of the German branch of the International Fellowship of Reconciliation. And together they thought about possibilities how to reconcile the relationships of the Baltic Germans and the Estonians. Edith also published a journal that included writings about the International Fellowship of Reconciliation in 3 languages that were Estonia, German and Russia. But after a few years, the active role of Hugo and Edith Rahamägi decreased in the Baltic movement, and they no longer participated to the organizing of the second conference. The main motives to organize the second Baltic Conference were different when compared to the first one. On the course of 1930s, the rise of fascism created a major threat to the world peace, which could be seen clearly, for example, from the Italy's invasion into Ethiopia in 1935, or from the Spanish Civil War, or from the immensely increased military spending of the fascist Germany and the annexation of Austria in March 1938. All this political instability created the main motive to organize the Second Baltic Conference after 10 years. This can be seen already from the beginning of the invitation letter, which says, quote, "Being aware of the current scary and serious situation, we want to gather together to find Christ's answer to the questions that the current chaotic situation raises." End quote. The conferees tried to find solutions to the question how Christians could maintain world peace, which was now threatened. Therefore, the presentations handled mostly subjects like how Christians should think about nationalism, war, and how Christians could take the ideas of non-violence to the worldly politics. The practical organizing of the Helsinki's Baltic Conference were given to 2 persons in Finland, called Siegfried Sirenius and Edwin Stenvall. They both were Lutheran priests who were inspired by Christian social ideas. Sirenius had brought the Christian-based settlement movement into Finland in the beginning of the 1920s, which aimed to improve the life quality of the working class by providing free education and social activities, and Stenvall had been active in the Finnish peace movement during the 1920s and the 1930s. Still, neither Sirenius or Stenvall had participated to the first Baltic Conference with the other Finnish participants. Neither they had been active in the International Fellowship of Reconciliation, despite the fact that it had an active Finnish branch during the 1920s. So the question is why these 2 fellows were the ones who took the main responsibility on the organizing of the Second Baltic Conference in Helsinki. The reason for this is that their thinking were very similar with the thinking of Nathanael Besko, and they had been actively in contact with him. Stenvall published a magazine that was called Frid på jorden, organ för fred och kristet samhällsliv, which focused especially on the questions of peace from the Christian pacifist point of view. As the name of the magazine implies, Stenvall relied strongly on the principles of the Förbundet för kristet samhällsliv, which also saw Christian pacifism as being a crucial part of the organization's ideology. On a regular basis, Stenvall published reports on the work of the Förbundet för kristet samhällsliv and speeches of Nathanael Besko in the magazine. As the threat of war grew in 1938, it is clear that Stenvall, as a Christian pacifist, wanted to do something in order to maintain world peace. To Stenvall, as a supporter of the work of Besko and the Förbundet för kristet samhällsliv, the organizing of the Second Baltic Conference was a motivating, natural and easy way to act according to his Christian pacifist vocation in a times of political crisis. In the case of Siegfried Sirenius and Besko, the similarity in their thinking and their connection with each other was due to their affiliation with the settlement movement, because it was Nathanael Besko who had established the settlement movement in Sweden in year 1912, and this was the main reason why they had been in contact actively with each other. What is especially interesting in the thinking of Sirenius is that it is known from earlier research that Sirenius wanted, exactly like Besko, to, quote, build bridges, end quote, between Christians and socialists. And one of the main aims of the settlement movement was likewise to break the barriers between different social classes. Like Stenvall and Besko, Sirenius wanted, with the help of the Second Baltic Conference, to maintain world peace. So as a conclusion, the Christian social ideology typical to the settlement movement and the more radical form of it, the Christian socialist ideology prevalent in the International Fellowship of Reconciliation, were intertwined strongly with the ideology of Christian pacifism. And these ideologies together created the main motivation to organize the Second Baltic Conference. These ideological motifs were also prevalent in the social networks organizing the First Baltic Conference. But in the year 1928 there were also more diverse motifs, like for example the settling of the domestic church political question in Estonia that motivated the organizers. As in the Second Baltic Conference, the chaotic world political situation in 1938 created the number one motive to organize this Baltic Conference. Nevertheless, the one combining and carrying idea in these social networks around the two Baltic conferences was that Christianity and socialism should not be seen as opposites but as complementary. As the East was seen as a socialist bloc and the West as a Christian bloc, the idea was that the Baltic countries could work as a bridge between these two ideologies. A bridge between East and West meant dialogue between Christians and socialists. This idea of dialogue and bridge building motivated the organizers of the Second Baltic Conferences even more as the threat of war grew. The idea was that through peace and bridge building, peace can be sustained. Thank you.